My bad. Hello. Um, that was a little bit of a technical goof on my part. That's my bad. um, but yeah, hi. On the bright side, I don't think anyone's here, so I don't think anyone saw that. So we can just brush it off and say it's fine. But yeah, Hello. For some of you, you haven't seen me in about 3 or 4 days. Yeah, it would technically be 4 days. But for a lot of you, you probably haven't seen me like all week. Because I did stream on Monday, but it didn't seem like too many people came along and came out to see it. But I was planning on streaming back on Sunday, but like, you know, the monthly hormones, as they say, they started to kick in like literally that morning, and by the time I was supposed to stream, I mean, even before then, I was just like in such low like spirits and kind of tired and lethargic. So honestly, once I canceled the Wednesday stream, by the time I would have actually like started up the stream, I was like going to bed. That's how bad it was. And also, I've been having some mouth issues. I've begun getting the canker sores again, and this time I got one like on the side of my tongue, like right where it like rubs up against like one of my molars. So that's just been like a thing. It's been really hard to eat because of it, but I've been pulling through. It seems like it's doing a bit better today. So I'm gonna just go ahead and try my best. In order to catch people up, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this right now, or even in the future, they probably don't know what's going on, but to put it shortly, Paul Shelton is now trapped in Annie Wilkes' basement, without one leg, well, without one foot and one thumb. A lot happened in the last read through. It was pretty intense. Let me take a sip of my tea. But yeah, I really hope my throat doesn't give out on me, because I feel like now's the time for me to just go ahead and get right into it. Let me take a sip of water first, just to like lubricate the old pipes. Alright, hopefully that should do it. No, we're just gonna get right into it. He dozed a little and woke up slumped far over to the left, with his head hung down like a drunk in an alley. He straightened up and his legs cursed him roundly. He used the bedpan and it hurt to piss, and he realized with some dismay that a urinary infection was probably setting in. He was so vulnerable now. So fucking vulnerable to everything. He put the urinal aside and picked up the hypo again. A light dose of scopolamine, she said. Well, maybe so. Or maybe she loaded it with a hot shot of something. The sort of stuff she used on folks like Ernie Gonyar and Queenie Bolafont. Then he smiled a little. Would that really be so bad? The answer was a resounding hell no. It would be good. The pilings would disappear forever. No more low tide. Forever. With that thought in mind, he found the pulse in his left thigh, and though he had never injected himself in his life, he did it efficiently now, even eagerly. Let me take another sip. It's another one of those things where like it's like a single chapter is like a single page. I guess that's to like make it more poetic or something. I'm still not sure why exactly it is. He did not die, and he did not sleep. The pain went away, and he drifted, feeling almost untethered from his body. A balloon of thought drifting at the end of a long string. You were also Sherazade to yourself, he thought, and looked at the barbecue pot. He thought of Martian death rays, burning London in fire. He thought suddenly of a song, a disco tune. Something by a group called the Tramps. Burn, baby, burn. Burn the mother down. something flickered. Same idea. Burn the mother down. Paul Sheldon slept. When he woke up, the cellar was filled with the ashy light of dawn. A very large rat sat on the tray Annie had left him, nibbling cheese with its tail neatly curled around its body. Paul screamed, jerked, then screamed again as pain flowed up his legs. The rat fled. She had left him some capsules. He knew better that the novel wouldn't take care of the pain, but it was better than nothing. Oh, it's snack time already, man. I mean, let's wait till the end of the chapter, alright? Besides, pain or no pain, it's time for the old morning fix, right, Paul? He washed two of the caps down with Pepsi, and then leaned back, feeling the dull throb in his kidneys. He was growing something down there, alright? Great. Martians, he thought. Martian death machines. He looked toward the barbecue pot, expecting it to look like a barbecue pot in the morning light. A barbecue pot and nothing else. He was surprised to find it still looked to him like one of Wells's striding machines of destruction. He had an idea. What was it? The song came back, the one by the Tramps. Burn, baby, burn. Burn the mother down. Yeah, and just what mother is that? She wouldn't even leave you a candle. You couldn't light a fart. Up came a message from the boys in the sweatshop. You don't need to burn anything now. Or here. What the fuck are we talking about, guys? Could you let me in on... Then it came. It came at once. The way all the ideas really came. Rounded and smooth and utterly persuasive in its baleful perfection. Burn the mother down. He looked at the barbecue pot, expecting the pain of what he had done, what she made him do, to return. It did, but it was dull and faint. The pain in his kidneys was worse. What had she said yesterday? All I ever did was talk you out of a bad book you'd written and into the best one you ever wrote. Maybe there was a queer sort of truth in that. Maybe he had wildly overestimated just how good fast cars had been. That's just your mind trying to heal itself, part of him whispered. If you ever get out of this, you'll work yourself around in much the same fashion to thinking you never needed your left foot anyway. Hell, 5 less nails to clip. And they do wonders with prosthetics these days. No, Paul, one was a damned good book and the other was a damned good foot. Let's not kid ourselves. Yet a deeper part of him suspected that to think that way was kidding himself. No, not kidding yourself, Paul. Tell the goddamn truth, lying to yourself. A guy who makes up stories, a guy like that is lying to everyone. So that guy can't even lie to himself. It's funny, but it's also the truth. Once you start that shit, you might as well just cover up your typewriter and start studying for a broker's license or something, because you're down the toilet. So what was the truth? The truth, should you insist, was that the increasing dismissal of his work in the critical press as that of a popular writer, which was, as he understood it, one step, a small one, above that of a hack, had hurt him quite badly. It didn't jive with his self-image as a serious writer who was only churning out these shitty romances in order to subsidize his flourish the trumpets, please real work. Had he hated misery? Had he really? If so, why had it been so easy to slip back into her world? No, more than easy. Blissful. Like slipping into a warm bath with a good book by one hand and a cold beer by the other. Perhaps all he had hated was the fact that her face on the dust jackets had overshadowed his and his author photographs, not allowing the critics to see that they were dealing with a young mailer or achiever here, that they were dealing with a heavyweight here. As a result, hadn't his serious fiction become steadily more self-conscious? A sort of scream? Look at me. Look how good this is. Hey, guys. This stuff has got a sliding perspective. Oh, I lost my place. This stuff has got stream of consciousness interludes. This is my real work, you assholes. Don't you dare turn away from me. Don't you dare, you cockadoodle brats. Don't you dare turn away from my real work. Don't you dare, or I'll... What? What would he do? Cut off their feet? Saw off their thumbs? Paul was seized by a sudden fit of shivering. He had to urinate. He grabbed the bedpan and finally managed, although it hurt worse than before. He moaned while he was pissing, and continued moaning for a long while after it was done. Finally, mercifully, the novel began to kick in. A little, and he drowsed. He looked at the barbecue pot with heavy-lidded eyes. How would you feel if she made you burn Misery's Return? The interior voice whispered, and he jumped a little. Drifting away, he realized that it would hurt, yes. It would hurt terribly. It would make the pain he had felt when fast cars went up in smoke look like the pain of his kidney infection compared to what he had felt when she brought the axe down, cutting off his foot, exercising editorial authority over his body. He also realized that wasn't even the real question. The real question was how it would make Annie feel. There was a table near the barbecue pot. There were maybe half a dozen jars and cans on it. One was a can of charcoal lighter fluid. What if Annie was the one screaming in pain? Are you curious about how that might sound? Are you curious at all? The proverb says revenge is a dish best eaten cold, but Ronson Fastlight had yet to be invented when they made that one up. Paul thought, burn the mother down, and fell asleep. There was a little smile on his pale and fading face. Okay. We're gonna have like a little bit of a snack. Also, my chat is like really low. I didn't even see there was like an actual message there. Huh. I don't know why it like shifted so much. And also, as you can see, the chat on screen is now a different font. I actually wanted it to be this font at first when I was setting it up, but for whatever reason, initially it wasn't setting up correctly, and it just like showed as like Arial or whatever. But I figured out it was because I didn't have this font like downloaded on my computer, and it just like wasn't showing up correctly. So once I got it downloaded, everything worked fine. Let me just try and open this as quietly as humanly possible. Ugh, plastic. Very loud plastic. Okay. It's a very Juniper Heartstrings font, yeah. It's also the same one as my alerts. If some of you have noticed. Some of you might have noticed. Maybe. But yeah. I'm very happy with how that turned out. Alright. Let me just sit here and chew. I have to chew very carefully so I don't irritate that canker sore. Ah, too late. Shit. I mean, it's not as bad as it was yesterday. Yesterday I was like trying to eat a granola bar and I was just like pounding my hand on the table in pain. It's a lot better today, I think. Very important that I get my water in. Now let's just get a sip of tea for the road. Alright. Alright. When Annie arrived back at 3:15 that afternoon, her normally frizzy hair flattened around her head in the shape of the helmet she had been wearing. Her normally frizzy hair flattened around her head in the shape of the helmet she had been wearing. She was in a silent mood that seemed to indicate tiredness and reflection rather than depression. When Paul asked her if everything had gone all right, she nodded. Yes, I think so. I had some trouble starting the bike, or I would have been back an hour ago. The plugs were dirty. How are your legs, Paul? Do you want another shot before I take you upstairs? After almost 20 hours in the dampness, his legs felt as if someone had studded them with rusty nails. He wanted a shot very badly, but not down here. That would not do at all. I think I'm alright. She turned her back to him and squatted. Alright, grab on. But remember what I said about chokeholds and things like that? I'm very tired, and I don't think I'd react very well to funny jokes. I seem to be all out of jokes. Good. She lifted him with a moist grunt, and Paul had to bite back a scream of agony. She walked across the floor toward the stairs, her head turned slightly, and he realized she was, or might be, looking at the can-littered table. Her glance was short, seemingly casual, but to Paul it seemed to go on for a very long time, and he was sure she would realize the can of lighter fluid was no longer there. It was stuffed down the back of his underpants instead. Long months after his earlier depredations, he had finally summoned up the courage to steal something else. And if her hand slipped on his legs, if her hand slipped up his legs as she climbed the stairs, she was going to grab more than a handful of his skinny ass. Man, this book, I swear. Then she glanced away from the table with no change of expression, and his relief was so great that the thudding, shifting ascent up the stairs to the pantry was almost bearable. She kept up a very good poker face when she wanted to, but he hoped, that he had fooled her. That this time he had really fooled her. I guess I'd like that shot after all, Annie, he said when she had him back in bed. She studied his white, sweat-beaded face for a moment, then nodded and left the room. As soon as she was gone, he slid the flat can out of his underwear and under the mattress. He had not put anything under there since the knife, and he did not intend to leave the lighter fluid there long, but it would have to stay there for the rest of the day. Tonight he intended to put it in another, safer place. She came back and gave him an injection. Then she put a steno pad and some freshly sharpened pencils on the windowsill and rolled his wheelchair over so it was by the bed. There, she said. I'm going to get some sleep. If a car comes in, I'll hear it. If we're left alone, I'll probably sleep right through until tomorrow morning. If you want to get up and work in longhand, here's your chair. Your manuscript is over there, on the floor. I frankly don't advise it until your legs start to warm up a little, though. I couldn't right now, but I guess I'll probably soldier along a while tonight. I understand what you meant about time being short now. I'm glad you do, Paul. How long do you think you need? Under ordinary circumstances, I'd say a month. The way I've been working just lately, 2 weeks. If I really go into overdrive, 5 days. Or maybe a week. It'll be ragged, but it'll be there. She sighed and looked down at her hands with dull concentration. I know it's going to be less than 2 weeks. I wish you'd promise me something. She looked at him with no anger or suspicion, only faint curiosity. What? Not to read anymore until I'm done. Or until I have to, stop? Yes. Or until I have to stop. That way you'll get the conclusion without a lot of fragmentation. It'll have a lot more punch. It's going to be a good one, isn't it? Wait, who's that? Chris Pilled? I can't read. Christ Pilled. Good name, thank you. Thank you for the follow. It's going to be a good one, isn't it? Yes, Paul smiled. It's going to be very hot stuff. Yeah, thank you, Christ Pilled. Always appreciated. I have some other people followed me that I still have to thank, but I haven't pulled up a list lately. I'll have to do that at the end of the stream because I don't like I don't like just like letting people slip by without me thanking them. I try to thank everyone at least once. Okay, let me take a sip of tea. That night, around 8 o'clock, he hoisted himself carefully into the wheelchair. He listened and heard nothing at all from upstairs. He had been hearing the same nothing ever since the squeak of the bed springs announced her lying down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She really must have been tired. Paul got the lighter fluid and rolled across to the spot by the window where his informal little writer's camp was pitched. Here was the typewriter with the 3 missing teeth and its unpleasant grin. Here's the wastebasket. Here, the pencils and pads and typing paper and piles of scrap rewrite, some of which he would use, and some of which would go into the wastebasket, or would have before. Here, all unseen, was the door to another world. Here, too, he thought, was his own ghost in a series of overlays, like still pictures which, when rifled rapidly, gave the illusion of movement. He wove the chair between the piles of paper and the casually stacked pads with the ease of long practice, listened once more, then reached down and pulled out a 9-inch section of the baseboard. He had discovered it was loose about a month ago, and he could see by the thin film of dust on it. Next you'll be taping hairs across it yourself just to make sure, he thought, that Annie hadn't known this loose piece of board was here. Behind it was a narrow space empty save for dust and a plentiful scattering of mouse turds. He stowed the can of Fastlight in the space and pushed the board back into place. He had an anxious moment when he was afraid it would no longer fit flush against its mates. And God, her eyes were so fucking sharp. And then it slipped neatly home. Paul regarded this a moment, then opened his pad, picked up a pencil, and found the hole in the paper. He wrote undisturbed for the next 4 hours, until the points on all 3 of the pencils she had sharpened for him were written flat. And then he rolled himself back to the bed, got in, and went easily off to sleep. Alright. Oh man, this next chapter is like getting like back into the book that he's writing. It's very meta if you're not familiar with it. Let me just take a sip of water just to be sure. I'm really trying to not like let my voice go out on me tonight, because this is where it really matters. I gotta like make it count. Joffrey's arms were beginning to feel like white iron. He had been standing in the deep shadows outside the hut which belonged to Michibi, Beautiful One, for the last 5 minutes, looking rather like a too slim version of the circus strongman with the Baroness's trunk poised over his head. Just as he came to believe that nothing Hezekiah could say would convince Michibi to leave his hut, he heard sounds of movement. Joffrey turned even further, the muscles in his arms now twitching wildly. Chief Michibi, Beautiful One, was the keeper of the fire, and inside his hut were better than 100 torches, the head of each coated with a thick, gummy resin. The resin oozed from the low trees of the area, and the Borga called it fire oil, or fire blood oil. Like most essentially simple languages, that of the Borgas could at times be oddly elusive. Whatever you called the stuff, however, there were enough torches in there to get the whole village afire. It would burn like a Guy Fawkes dummy, Joffrey thought. If, that was, Michibi could be gotten out of the way. Fear not to strike, Boss Geffy Hezekiah had said. Oh, it's Boss Jeffy. Sometimes it's like hard to decipher like what's like actually speaking in here. Michibi, he come out first one, 'cause he the fireman. Hezekiah, he be coming out second one, so you don't be waiting to see my gold tooth flash. You break that brat's head damn quick. But when he actually did hear them coming, Joffrey felt a moment's doubt in spite of the agony in his arms. Suppose that just this once, the one... His pencil paused in mid-word at the sound of an approaching engine. He was surprised at how calm he felt. The strongest emotion in him right now was mild annoyance at being interrupted, just like when it was... mild annoyance at being interrupted just when it was starting to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Annie's boot heels rattled staccato down the hallway. Get out of sight. Her face was tight and grim. The khaki bag, unzipped, was over her shoulder. Get out of She paused and saw that he had already rolled the wheelchair back from the window. She looked to make sure that none of his things were on the sill, then nodded. It's the state police, she said. She looked tense, but in control. The shoulder bag was within easy reach of her right hand. Are you gonna be good, Paul? Yes, he said. Her eyes searched his face. I'm going to trust you, she said finally, and turned away, closing the door but not bothering to lock it. The car turned into the driveway, the smooth, sleepy beat of that big 442 Plymouth engine, almost like a trademark. He heard the kitchen screen door bang shut and eased the wheelchair close enough to the window so he could remain in an angle of shadow and still peek out. The cruiser pulled up to where Annie stood and the engine died. The driver got out and stood almost exactly where the young trooper had been standing when he spoke his last 4 words. But there all resemblance ended. That trooper had been a weedy young man hardly out of his teens. A rookie cop pulling a shit detail, chasing the cold trail of some numbnuts rider who had wrecked up his car and then either staggered deeper into the woods to die or walked blithely away from the whole mess with his thumb cocked. The cop currently unfolding himself from behind the cruiser's wheel was about 40, with shoulders seemingly as wide as a barn beam. His face was a square of granite with a few narrow lines carved into it at the eyes and the corners of the mouth. Annie was a big woman, but this fellow made her look almost small. There was another difference as well. The trooper Annie killed had been alone. Getting out the shotgun seat of this cruiser was a small, slope-shouldered plainclothesman with lank blonde hair. David and Goliath, Paul thought. Mutt and Jeff. Jesus. The plainclothesman did not so much walk around the cruiser as mince around it. His face looked old and tired, the face of a man who's half asleep, except for his faded blue eyes. The eyes were wide awake, everywhere at once. Paul thought he would be quick. They bookended Annie and she was saying something to them, first looking up to speak to Goliath, then half turning and looking down to reply to David. Paul wondered what would happen if he broke the window again and screamed for help again. He thought the odds were maybe 8 in 10 that they would take her. Oh, she was quick. But the big cop looked as if he might be quicker in spite of his size, and strong enough to uproot middling-sized trees with his bare hands. The plainclothesman's self-conscious walk might be as deliberately deceptive as his sleepy look. He thought they would take her, except what surprised them wouldn't surprise her, and that gave her an outside chance anyway. The plainclothesman's coat, it was buttoned in spite of the glaring heat. If she shot Goliath first, she might very well be able to put a slug in David's face before he could get that oogie goddamn coat unbuttoned and get his gun out. More than anything else, that buttoned coat suggested that Annie had been right. So far, this was just a routine check back. So far. I didn't kill him, you know. You killed him. If you had kept your mouth shut, I would have sent him on his way. He'd be alive now. Did he believe that? No, of course not. But there was still that strong, hurtful moment of guilt, like a quick, deep stab wound. Was he going to keep his mouth shut because there were 2 chances in 10 that she would off those 2 as well if he opened it? The guilt stabbed quickly again and was gone. The answer to that was also no. It would be nice to credit himself with such selfless motives, but it wasn't the truth. The fact was simple. He wanted to take care of Annie Wilkes himself. They could only put you in jail, bitch, he thought. I know how to hurt you. Alright. Let me take another sip. And I should probably get a little bit more tea. Let me just pour a little bit. I'm really hoping that ginger kicks in pretty quick, because I feel like I'm gonna need it. And let me just go ahead and put that on the hot pad. Man, this mug warmer is like the best 20 bucks I've ever spent, man. It's amazing. There was always the possibility, of course, that they would smell a rat. Rat catching was, after all, their job, and they would know Annie's background. If that was the way things turned out, so be it. But he thought Annie might just be able to wriggle past the law this one last time. Paul now knew as much of the story as he needed to know, he supposed. Annie had listened to the radio constantly since her long sleep, and the missing state cop, whose name was Duane Kushner, was big news. The fact that he had been searching for traces of a hotshot writer named Paul Sheldon was reported, but Kushner's disappearance had not been linked, even speculatively, with Paul's own. At least not yet. The spring runoff had sent his Camaro rolling and tumbling 5 miles down the wash. It might have lain undiscovered in the forest for another month or another year, but for merest coincidence. A couple of National Guard chopper jockeys sent out as part of a random drug control sweep, looking for backcountry pot farmers, in other words, had seen a sun flash on what remained of the Camaro's windshield, and sat down in a nearby clearing for a closer look. The seriousness of the crash itself had been masked by the violent battering the Camaro had taken as it traveled to its final resting place. If the car had yielded traces of blood to forensic analysis, if indeed there had been a forensic analysis, the radio did not say so. Paul knew that even an exhaustive analysis would turn up precious few traces of blood. His car had spent most of the spring with snowmelt running through it at flood speed. And in Colorado, most of the attention and concern were focused on Trooper Duane Kushner, as he supposed these 2 visitors proved. So far, all speculation centered on 3 illegal substances: moonshine, marijuana, and cocaine. It seemed possible that Kushner might have stumbled across the growing distilling or stockpiling of one of these substances quite by accident during his search for signs of the tenderfoot writer. And as hope of finding Kushner alive began to fade, questions about why he had been out there alone in the first place began to grow louder. And while Paul doubted if the state of Colorado had money enough to finance a buddy system for its vehicle police, they were obviously combing the area for Kushner in pairs, taking no chances. Goliath now gestured toward the house. Annie shrugged and shook her head. David said something. After a moment, she nodded and led them up the path to the screen door. Paul heard the screen's hinges squeak, and then they were in. The sound of so many footfalls out there was tightening, almost a profanation. What time was it when he came by? Goliath asked. It had to be Goliath. He had a rumbling Midwestern voice, roughened by cigarettes. Around 4, Annie said, give or take. She had just finished mowing the grass and she didn't wear a watch. It had been devilish hot. She remembered that well enough. How long did he stay, Miss Wilkes? David asked. Mrs. How long did he stay, Mrs. Wilkes? David asked. It's Miss Wilkes, if you don't mind. Excuse me. Annie said she couldn't reckon on how long for sure. Only it hadn't been long. 5 minutes, maybe. He showed you a picture? Yes, Annie said. That was why he came. Paul marveled at how composed she sounded. How pleasant. And had you seen the man in the picture? Annie said certainly he was Paul Sheldon. She knew that right away. I have all his books, she said. I like them very much. That disappointed Officer Kushner. He said if that was the case, he guessed I probably knew what I was talking about. He looked very discouraged. He also looked very hot. Yeah, it was a hot day, all right, Goliath said. And Paul was alarmed by how much closer his voice was. In the parlor? Yes, almost certainly in the parlor. Big or not, the guy moved like a goddamn lynx. When Annie responded, her own voice was closer. The cops had moved into the parlor. She was following. She hadn't asked them, but they had gone in there anyway, looking the place over. Although her pet writer was now less than 35 feet away, Annie's voice remained composed. She had asked if he would like to come in for an iced coffee. He said he couldn't, so she had asked if he'd like to take along a cold bottle of... Please don't break that, Annie interrupted herself, her voice sharpening. I like my things, and some of them are quite fragile. Sorry, ma'am. It had to be David, his voice low and whispery, both humble and a little startled. That tone coming from a cop would have been amusing under other circumstances. But these were not other circumstances, and Paul was not amused. He sat stiffly, hearing the small sound of something being set carefully back down. The penguin on his block of ice, perhaps. His hands clasped tightly on the arms of the wheelchair. He imagined her fiddling with the shoulder bag. He waited for one of the cops, Goliath probably, to ask her just what the hell it was she had in there. Then the shooting would start. What were you saying? David asked. That I asked him if he wanted to take along a cold Pepsi from the fridge because it was such a hot day. I keep them right next to the freezer compartment, and that keeps them as cold as you can get without freezing them. He said that would be very kind. He was a very polite boy. Why did they let such a young boy out alone, do you know? Did he drink the soda here? David asked, ignoring her question. His voice was closer still. He had crossed the parlor. Paul didn't have to close his eyes to imagine him standing there, looking down the short hall which passed the little downstairs bathroom, and ended in the closed guest room door. Paul sat tight and upright, a pulse beating rapidly in his scrawny throat. No, Annie said, as composed as ever. He took it along. He said he had to keep rolling. What's down there? Goliath asked. There was a double thud of booted heels, the sound slightly hollow, as he stepped off the parlor carpet and onto the bare boards of the hallway. A bath and a spare bedroom. I sometimes sleep there when it's very hot. Have a look if you like, but I promise you I don't have your trooper tied to the bed. No, ma'am, I'm sure you don't, David said. And amazingly, their footfalls and voices began to fade toward the kitchen again. Did he seem excited about anything while he was in here? Not at all, Annie said. Just hot and discouraged. Paul was beginning to breathe again. Preoccupied about anything? No. Did he say where he was going next? Although the cops almost surely missed it, Paul's own practiced ear sensed the minutest of hesitations. There could be a trap here, a snare which might spring at once or after a short delay. No, she said at last, although he had headed west, so she assumed he must have gone towards Springer's Road and the few farms out that way. Thank you, ma'am, for your cooperation, David said. We may have to check back with you. All right, Annie said. Feel free. I don't see much company these days. Would you mind if we looked in your barn? Goliath asked abruptly. Not at all. Just be sure to say howdy when you go in. Howdy to who, ma'am? David asked. Why, to Misery, Annie said. My pig. She fed the cop to the pig. She fed the cop to the pig. This is fun. I like this. Alright. She stood in the doorway looking at him fixedly. So fixedly that his face began to feel warm, as he supposed he was blushing. The two cops had left 15 minutes ago. You see something green? He asked finally. Why didn't you holler? Both cops had tipped their hats to her as they got in their cruiser, but neither had smiled, and there had been a look in their eyes Paul had been able to see even from the narrow angle afforded by the corner of his window. They knew who she was, all right. I kept expecting you to holler. They would have fallen on me like an avalanche. Maybe. Maybe not. But why didn't you? Annie, if you spent your whole life thinking the worst thing you can imagine is going to happen, you have to be wrong some of the time. Don't be smart with me. He saw that beneath her assumed impassivity, she was deeply confused. His silence did not fit well into her view of all existence as a sort of big-time wrestling match. Honest Annie versus that all-time double ugly tag team of the Cockadoodle Brats. Who was being smart? I told you I was going to keep my mouth shut, and I did. I want to finish my book in relative peace, and I want to finish it for you. She looked at him uncertainly, wanting to believe, afraid to believe, and ultimately believing anyway. And she was right to believe, because he was telling the truth. Get busy then, she said softly. Get busy right away. You saw the way they looked at me. Well, let me just take some water. Gosh, we're only 20 pages in. It feels like so much longer. Well, we've still got like a couple, like an hour and some change left, I think. I mean, that's usually how long this sort of thing goes on for, you know? We're gonna get through it, one way or another, by the skin of my teeth. For the next 2 days, life went on just as it had before Duane Kushner. It was almost possible to believe Duane Kushner had never happened at all. Paul wrote almost constantly. He had given the typewriter up for the nonce, and he put it on the mantel below the picture of the Arc de Triomphe without comment. He filled 3 legal pads in those 2 days. There was only one left. When he had filled that one, he would move on to the steno pads. She sharpened his half-dozen barrel Black Warrior pencils. He wrote them dull, and then he sharpened them again. They shrank steadily as he sat in the sun by the window, bent over, sometimes scratching absently with the great toe of his right foot in the air, where the sole of his left foot had been, looking through the hole in the paper. It had yawned wide open again, and the book rushed towards its climax the way the best ones did, as if on a rocket sled. He saw everything with perfect clarity. 3 groups all hell-bent for misery in the crenellated passages behind the idol's forehead. 2 wanting to kill her. The 3rd consisting of Ian, Joffrey, and Hezekiah trying to save her. While below, the village of the Borkas burned and the survivors massed at the one point of egress, the idol's left ear, to massacre anyone who happened to stagger out alive. This hypnotic state of absorption was really shaken but not broken when, on the 3rd day after the visit of David and Goliath, a cream-colored Ford station wagon with KTKA/Grand Junction written on the side pulled into Annie's driveway. The back was full of video equipment. Oh God, Paul said, frozen somewhere between humor, amazement, and horror. What's this fuckero? The wagon had barely stopped before one of the rear doors flew open, and a guy dressed in combat fatigue pants and a Deadhead t-shirt leaped out. There was something big and black, pistol gripped in one hand, and for one wild moment Paul thought it was a tear gas gun. Then he raised it to his shoulder and swept it toward the house, and Paul saw it was a minicam. A pretty young woman was getting out of the front passenger seat, fluffing her blow-dried hair and pausing for one final appraising look at her makeup in the outside rearview mirror before joining her cameraman. The eye of the outside world, which had slipped away from the Dragon Lady these past few years, had now returned with a vengeance. Paul rolled backward quickly, hoping he had been in time. Well, if you want to know for sure, just check the 6 o'clock news, he thought, and then had to raise both hands to his mouth to plug up the giggles. The screen door banged open and shut. "Get the hell out of here," Annie screamed. "Get the hell off my land." Dimly, "Miss Wilkes, if we could just have a few... You can have a couple of loads of double-up, buck up your cockadoodle bumhole if you don't get out of here." "Miss Wilkes, I'm Glenna Roberts from KTKA. I don't care if you're John O. Jesus Johnny Cake Christ from the planet Mars. Get off my land or you're dead." "But... kapow!" "Oh, Annie, oh my Jesus, Annie, you killed that stupid broad." He rolled back and peeked through the window. He had no choice. He had to see. Relief gusted through him. Annie had fired into the air. That seemed to have done quite well. Glenna Roberts was diving headfirst into the KTKA newsmobile. The cameraman swung his lens toward Annie. Annie swung her shotgun toward the cameraman. The cameraman, deciding he wanted to live to see the Grateful Dead again more than he wanted to roll tape on the Dragon Lady, immediately dropped into the back seat again. The wagon was reversing down the driveway before he got his door all the way closed. Annie stood watching them go, the rifle held in one hand, and then she came slowly back into the house. He heard the clack as she put the rifle on the table. She came down to Paul's room. She looked worse than he had ever seen her, her face haggard and pale, her eyes darting constantly. "They're back," she whispered. "Take it easy. I knew all those brats would come back, and now they have. They're gone, Annie. You made them go." "They never go. Someone told them that cop was at Dragon Lady's house before he disappeared, so here they are." "Annie, you know what they want?" she demanded. "Of course. I've dealt with the press. They want the same two things they always want. For you to fuck up while the tape's running, and for someone else to buy the martinis when happy hour rolls around. But Annie, you've got to settle down." "This is what they want," she said, and raised one hooked hand to her forehead. She pulled down suddenly, sharply, opening 4 bloody furrows. Blood ran into her eyebrows, down her cheeks, along either side of her nose. "Annie, stop it. And this." She slapped herself across the left cheek with her left hand, hard enough to leave an imprint. "And this," the right cheek even harder, hard enough to make droplets of blood fly from the fingernail gouges. "Stop it," he screamed. "It's what they want," she screamed back. She raised her hands to her forehead and pressed them against the wounds, blotting them. She held her bloody palms out toward him for a moment. Then she plodded out of the room. After a long, long time, Paul began to write again. It went slowly at first. The image of Annie pulling those furrows into her skin kept intruding, and he thought it was going to be no good. He had just better pack it in for the day, when the story caught him and he fell through the hole in the paper again. As always these days, he went with a sense of blessed relief. Alright. I keep swallowing too suddenly. I gotta be better at that. More police came the next day. Local yokels this time. With them was a skinny man carrying a case which would only contain a steno machine. Annie stood in the driveway with them, listening, her face expressionless. Then she led them into the kitchen. Paul sat quietly, a steno pad of his own on his lap. He had finished the last legal pad the previous evening, and listened to Annie's voice as she made a statement which consisted of all the things she had told David and Goliath 4 days ago. This, Paul thought, was nothing more than blatant harassment. He was amused and appalled to find himself feeling a little sorry for Annie Wilkes. The Sidewinder cop, who asked most of the questions, began by telling Annie she could have a lawyer present if she wanted. Annie declined and simply retold her story. Paul could detect no deviations. They were in the kitchen for half an hour. Near the end, one of them asked how she had come by the ugly-looking scratches on her forehead. "I did it in the night," she said. "I had a bad dream." "What was that?" the cop asked. "I dreamed the people remembered me after all this time and started coming out here again," Annie said. When they were gone, Annie came into his room. Her face was doughy and distant and ill. This place is turning into Grand Central," Paul said. She didn't smile. "How much longer?" He hesitated, looking at the pile of typescript with the ragged stack of handwritten pages on top, then back at Annie. 2 days, he said. Maybe 3. "The next time they come, they'll have the search warrant," she said, and left before he could reply. Take a sip. Oh, perfect timing. Actually, let me take a sip of water too. We're only about a quarter of the way in right now? But we'll get into it even further with time. She came in that evening around 11:45 and said, "You should have been in bed an hour ago, Paul." He looked up, startled out of the story's deep dream. Joffrey, who had just turned out to be very much the hero of this one, had just come face to face with the hideous Queen Bee, whom he would have to battle to the death for Misery's life. "It doesn't matter," he said. "I'll turn in after a while. Sometimes you get it down or it gets away." He shook his hand, which was sore and throbbing. A large hand growth, half callous and half blister, had risen on the inside of his index finger, where the pencil pressed most firmly. He had pills, and they would take away the pain, but they would also blur his thoughts. "You think it's good, don't you?" she asked softly. "Really good. You're not doing it just for me anymore, are you?" "Oh no," he said. For a moment he trembled on the edge of saying something more. Or of saying, "It was never for you, Annie." Or all the other people out there who signed their letters your #1 fan. The minute you start to write, all those people are at the other end of the galaxy. Or something. "It was never for my ex-wives, or my mother, or for my father." The reason authors almost always put a dedication on a book, Annie, is because their selfishness even horrifies themselves in the end. But it would be unwise to say such a thing to her. He wrote until dawn was coming up in the east and then fell into bed and slept for 4 hours. His dreams were confused and unpleasant. In one of them, Annie's father was climbing a long flight of stairs. He had a basket of what appeared to be newspaper clippings in his arms. Paul tried to cry out to him, to warn him, but every time he opened his mouth, nothing came out but a neatly reasoned paragraph of narration. Although this paragraph was different each time he tried to scream, it always opened the same way. One day, about a week later, and out came Annie Wilkes, screaming, rushing down the hall, hands outstretched to give her father the killing push. Only her screams were becoming weird buzzing noises, and her body was rippling and humping and changing under her skirt and cardigan sweater, because Annie was changing into a bee. Oh, this is getting weird. Alright. Alright. Yeah, I gotta focus. Focusing. No one official came by the following day, but lots of unofficial people showed up. Designated gawkers. One of the cars was full of teenagers. When they turned into the driveway to reverse direction, Annie rushed out and screamed at them to get off her land before she shot them for the dirty dogs they were. "Fuck off, Dragon Lady," one of them shouted. "Where'd you bury him?" another yelled as the car backed out in a boil of dust. A third threw a beer bottle. As the car roared away, Paul could make out a bumper sticker pasted to the rear window. "Support the Sidewinder Blue Devils," it read. An hour later, he saw Annie stalk grimly past his window, drawing on a pair of work gloves as she headed for the barn. She came back sometime later with the chain. She had taken the time to interlace its stout steel loops with barbed wire. When this prickly knitting was padlocked across the driveway, she reached into her breast pocket and took out some red pieces of cloth. These she tied to several of the links to aid visibility. "It won't keep the cops out," she said when she finally came in, "but it'll keep the rest of the brats away." "Yes." "Your hand, it looks swollen." "Yes." "I hate to be a cockadoodle pest, Paul, but tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow? Really?" She brightened at once. "Yes, I think so. Probably around 6. "Paul, that's wonderful. Shall I start reading now, or...?" "I'd prefer that you wait." "Then I will." That tender, melting look had crept into her eyes again. He had come to hate her the most of all when she looked that way. "I love you, Paul. You know that, don't you?" "Yes," he said. "I know," and bent over his pad again. Alright. Let me pour some more tea, because mine's starting to get a little bit cold. Alright. And I'll just take a sip before we start doing the thing again. Oh, that ginger's really starting to set in. Ooh. My oh my. That evening, she brought him his Keflex pill. His urinary infection was improving, but very slowly. And a bucket of ice. She laid a neatly folded towel beside it and left without saying a word. Paul put his pencil aside. He had to use the fingers of his left hand to unbend the fingers of his right, and slipped his hand into the ice. He left it there until it was almost completely numb. When he took it out, the swelling seemed to have gone down a little. He wrapped the towel around it and sat, looking out into the darkness, until it began to tingle. He put the towel aside, flexed the hand for a while. The first few times made him grimace with pain, but then the hand began to limber up, and started to write again. At dawn, he rolled slowly over to his bed, lurched in, and was asleep at once. He dreamed he was lost in a snowstorm, only it wasn't snow. It was flying pages which filled the world, destroying direction, and each page was covered with typing, and all the N's and T's and E's were missing. And he understood that if he was still alive when the blizzard ended, he would have to fill them all in himself, by hand, deciphering words that were barely there. He woke up around 11, and almost as soon as Annie heard him stirring about, she came in with orange juices, pills, and a bowl of hot chicken soup. She was glowing with excitement. "It's a very special day, Paul, isn't it?" "Yes." He tried to pick up the spoon with his right hand and could not. It was puffy and red, so swollen the skin was shiny. When he tried to bend it into a fist, it felt as though long rods of metal had been pushed through it at random. The last few days, he thought, had been like some nightmare autographing session that just never ended. Oh, your poor hand, she cried. I'll get you another pill. I'll do it right now. No, this is the push. I want my head clear for it. But you can't write with your hand like that. No, he agreed. My hand's shot. I'm going to finish this baby the way I started, with that royal. Either 10 pages should see it through. I guess I can fight my way through that many N's, T's, and E's. I should have gotten you another machine, she said. She looked honestly sorry. Tears stood in her eyes. Paul thought that the occasional moments like this were the most ghastly of all, because in them he saw the woman she might have been if her upbringing had been right, or the drugs squirted out by all the funny little glands inside her had been less wrong, or both. I goofed. It's hard for me to admit that, but it's true. It was because I didn't want to admit that Dartmonger woman got the better of me. I'm sorry, Paul. Your poor hand. She raised it, gentle as Niobe at the pool, and kissed it. That's all right, he said. We'll manage, Ducky, Daddles, and I. I hate him, but I've got a feeling he hates me as well, so I guess we're even. Who are you talking about? The Royal. I've nicknamed it after a cartoon character. Oh. She trailed away, turned off, came unplugged. He waited patiently for her to return, eating his soup as he did so, holding the spoon awkwardly between the first and second fingers of his left hand. Or first and second fingers. At last she did come back and looked at him, smiling radiantly like a woman just awakening and realizing it was going to be a beautiful day. Soup almost gone? I've got something very special if it is. He showed her the bowl, empty except for a few noodles stuck to the bottom. See what a doobie I am, Annie? He said without even a trace of a smile. You're the most goodest doobie there ever was, Paul. And you've got a whole row of gold stars. In fact, wait till you see this. She left, leaving Paul to look first at the calendar, and then the Arc de Triomphe. He looked up at the ceiling and saw the interlinked W's waltzing drunkenly across the plaster. Last of all, he looked across at the typewriter at the vast, untidy pile of manuscript. Goodbye to all that, he thought randomly. And then Annie was bustling back in with another tray. On it were 4 dishes. Wedges of lemon on one, grated egg on a second, toast points on a third. In the middle was a larger plate, and on this one was a vast, ooky, gooey pile of caviar. I don't know if you like this stuff or not, she said shyly. I don't even know if I like it. I never had it. Paul began to laugh. It hurt his middle and it hurt his legs and it even hurt his hand. Soon he would probably hurt even more because Annie was paranoid enough to think that if someone was laughing, it must be at her. But still, he couldn't stop. He laughed until he was choking and coughing, his cheeks red, tears spurting from the corners of his eyes. The woman had cut off his foot with an axe and his thumb with an electric knife. And here she was with a big pile of caviar big enough to choke a warthog. And for a wonder, that black look of crevasse did not dawn on her face. She began to laugh with him instead. Let me take a sip. Caviar was supposed to be one of those things you either loved or hated. But Paul had never felt either way. If he was flying first class and a stewardess stuck a plate of it in front of him, he ate it and then forgot there was such a thing as caviar until the next time a stewardess stuck a plate of it in front of him again. But now he ate it hungrily with all the trimmings, as if discovering the great principle of food for the first time in his life. Annie didn't care for it at all. She nibbled at the one dainty teaspoon she'd put on a toast point, wrinkled her face in disgust and put it aside. Paul, however, plowed ahead with undimmed enthusiasm. In a space of 15 minutes, he had eaten half of Mount Beluga. He belched, covered his mouth, and looked guiltily at Annie, who went off in another gay burst of laughter. I think I'm going to kill you, Annie, he thought, and smiled warmly at her. I really do. I may go with you, probably will in fact, but I am going to go with a by-God belly full of caviar. Things could be worse. That was great, but I can't eat anymore, he said. You'd probably throw up if you did, she said. That stuff is very rich. She smiled back. There's another surprise. I have a bottle of champagne for later, when you finish this book. It's called Dom Perignon. It costs $75 for one bottle. But Chucky Yoder down at the liquor store says it's the best there is. Chucky Yoder is right, Paul said, thinking that it was partly Dom's fault that he had gotten himself into this hell in the first place. He paused for a moment and then said, There's something else I'd like as well, for when I finish. Oh, what's that? You said once that you had all my things. I do. Well, there was a carton of cigarettes in my suitcase. I'd like to have a smoke when I finished. Her smile had faded slowly. You know those things are no good for you, Paul. They cause cancer. Annie, would you say that cancer is something I have to worry about just now? She didn't answer. I just want that one single cigarette. I've always leaned back and smoked one when I finished. It's the one that always tastes the best, believe me. Even better than the one you have after a really fine meal. And at least that's how it used to be. I suppose this time it'll make me feel dizzy and like puking, but I like that little link with the past. What do you say, Annie? Be a sport. I have been. Alright. But before the champagne, I'm not drinking a $75 bottle of fizzy beer in the same room where you've been blowing about that poison. That's fine. If you bring it to me around noon, I'll put it on the windowsill where I can look at it once in a while. I'll finish, and then I'll fill in the letters, and then I'll smoke it until I feel like I'm gonna fall down unconscious. And then I'll butt it. Then I'll call you. Alright, she said. But I'm still not happy about it. Even if you don't get lung cancer from just one, I'm still not happy about it. And do you know why, Paul? No. Because only don't bees smoke, she said, and began to gather up the dishes. Mr. Boss, Ian, is she... Shh, Ian hissed fiercely, and Hezekiah subsided. Joffrey felt a pulse beating with wild rapidity in his throat. From outside came the steady, soft creak of lines and rigging, the slow flap of the sails, and the first faint breezes of the freshening trade winds, the occasional cry of a bird. Dimly from the afterdeck, Joffrey could hear a gang of men singing a shanty and bellowing off-key voices. But in here all was silence as the three men, two white and one black, waited to see if Misery would live, or... Ian groaned hoarsely, and Hezekiah gripped his arm. Joffrey merely tightened his already hysterically tight hold on himself. After all of this, could God really be cruel enough to let her die? Once he would have denied such a possibility confidently, and with humor rather than indignation. The idea that God could be cruel would in those days have struck him as absurd. But his ideas about God, like his ideas about so many other things, had changed. They had changed in Africa. In Africa, he had discovered that there was not just one God, but many, and some were more than cruel. They were insane, and that changed all. Cruelty, after all, was understandable. With insanity, however, there was no arguing. These wretched musings were interrupted by a harsh, half-superstitious gasp from Hezekiah. Mr. Boss Ian! Mr. Boss Joffrey, look! She eyes! Look, she eyes! Misery's eyes, that gorgeously delicate shade of cornflower blue, had fluttered open. They passed from Ian to Joffrey and then back to Ian again. For a moment, Joffrey saw only puzzlement in those eyes, and then recognition dawned in them, and he felt gladness roar through his soul. "Where am I?" she said, yawning and stretching. "Ian, Joffrey, are we at sea? Why am I so hungry?" Laughing, crying, Ian Benton hugged her, speaking her name over and over again. Bewildered but pleased, she hugged him back, and because he knew she was all right, Joffrey found he could abide their love now and forever. He would live alone, could live alone, in perfect peace. Perhaps the gods were not insane after all, at least not all of them. He touched Hezekiah on the shoulder. "I think we should leave them alone, old man, don't you?" "I guess that'd be right, Mr. Boss Jeffrey," Hezekiah said. He grinned widely, flashing all 7 of his gold teeth. Joffrey stole one last look at her, and just for a moment those cornflower eyes flashed his way, warming him, filling him, fulfilling him. "I love you, my darling," he thought. "Do you hear me?" Perhaps the answer which came back was only the wistful calls of his own mind. But he thought not. It was too clear, too much her own voice. "I hear, and I love you too." Joffrey closed the door and went up to the afterdeck. Instead of throwing himself over the rail, as he might have done, he lit his pipe and smoked a bowl of tobacco slowly, watching the sun go down behind that distant, disappearing cloud on the horizon. That cloud which was the coast of Africa. And then, because he could not stand to do otherwise, Paul Sheldon rolled the last page out of the typewriter and scrawled the most loved and hated phrase in the writer's vocabulary with a pen. The end. Let me take another sip. You know, I thought he was gonna put in some kind of like bullshit ending again just to like piss her off, because I think his plan is that like he's gonna like light the place on fire while she's reading it or whatever. But I don't know. That's just speculation. His swollen right hand had not wanted to fill in the missing letters, but he had to force it through the work nonetheless. If he wasn't able to work at least some of the stiffness out of it, he was not going to be able to carry through with this. When it was done, he put the pen aside. He regarded his work for a moment. He felt as he always did when he finished a book. Queerly empty, let down, aware that for each little success he had paid a toll of absurdity. It was always the same, like toiling uphill through jungle and breaking out into a clearing at the top after months of hell, only to discover nothing more rewarding than the view of a freeway with a few gas stations and bowling alleys thrown in for good behavior or something. Still, it was good to be done. Always good to be done. Good to have produced, to have caused a thing to be. In a numb sort of way, he understood and appreciated the bravery of the act, of making little lives that weren't, creating the appearance of motion and the illusion of warmth. He understood, now finally, that he was a bit of a dullard at doing this trick, but it was the only one he knew, and if he always ended up doing it ineptly, he at least never failed to do it with love. He touched the pile of manuscript and smiled a little bit. He had left the big pile of paper installed to the single Marlboro she had put on the windowsill for him. Beside it was a ceramic ashtray with a paddle wheel excursion boat printed on the bottom, encircled by the words, "Souvenir of Hannibal, Missouri, home of America's storyteller." In the ashtray was a book of matches, but there was only one match in it. All she had allowed him. One, however, should be enough. He could hear her moving around upstairs. That was good. He would have plenty of time to make his few little preparations. Plenty of warning if she decided to come down before he was quite ready for her. Here comes the real trick, Annie. Let's see if I can do it. Let's see. Can I? He bent over, ignoring the pain in his legs, and began to work the loose section of baseboard out with his fingers. Alright, it's about to take off. I mean, we're about halfway through. So this next bit should be like pretty easy to read, since it's gonna be like a big action scene. He called for her 5 minutes later and listened to her heavy, somehow toneless tread on the stairs. He had expected to feel terrified when things got to this point, and was relieved to find he felt quite calm. The room was filled with the reek of lighter fluid. It dripped steadily from one side of the board which lay across the arms of his wheelchair. "Paul, are you really done?" she called down the length of the hallway. Paul looked at the pile of papers sitting on the board beside the hateful royal typewriter. Lighter fluid soaked the stack. "Well," he called back, "I did the best I could, Annie." "Wow. Oh, great. Gee, I can hardly believe it. After all this time. Just a minute, I'll get the champagne." "Fine." He heard her cross the kitchen linoleum, knowing where each squeak was going to come the instant before it did come. "I am hearing all these sounds for the last time," he thought. And that brought a sense of wonder. And wonder broke the calm open like an egg. The fear was inside. But there was something else in there as well. He supposed it was the receding coast of Africa. The refrigerator door was opened, then banged shut. Here she came across the kitchen again. Here she came. He had not smoked the cigarette, of course. It still lay on the windowsill. It had been the match he wanted. That one single match. What if it doesn't light when you strike it? But it was far too late for such considerations. He reached over to the ashtray and picked up the matchbook. He tore out the single match. She was coming down the hallway now. Paul struck the match and, sure enough, it didn't light. Easy. Easy does it. He struck it again. Nothing. Easy. Easy. He scratched it along the rough dark brown strip on the back of the book a third time, and a pale yellow flame bloomed at the end of the paper stick. "I just hope this..." She stopped. The next word pulled back inside her like... Yeah, let me reread that. "I just hope this..." She stopped. The next word pulled back inside her. She sucked in breath. Paul sat in his wheelchair behind a barricade of heaped paper, an ancient royal stenography. He had purposely turned the top sheet around so she could read this. "Misery's Return" by Paul Sheldon. Above the sopping pile of paper, Paul's swollen right hand hovered, and held between the thumb and first finger was a single burning match. She stood in the doorway holding a bottle of champagne wrapped in a strip of toweling. Her mouth dropped open. She closed it with a snap. "Paul," cautiously, "what are you doing?" "It's done," he said. "And it's good, Annie. You were right. The best of the misery books, and maybe the best thing I ever wrote, mongrel dog or not. Now I'm going to do a little trick with it. It's a good trick. I learned it from you." "Paul, no!" she screamed. Her voice was full of agony and understanding. Her hands flew out, the bottle of champagne dropping from them unheeded. It hit the floor and exploded like a tornado. Curds of foam flew everywhere. "No, no, please don't." "Too bad you'll never read it," Paul said, and smiled at her. It was his first real smile in months, radiant and genuine. False modesty aside, I've got to say it was better than good. It was great, Annie. The match was guttering, printing its small heat on the tips of his fingers. He dropped it. For one terrible moment, he thought it had gone out, and then pale blue fire uncoiled across the title page with an audible sound. Foomp! It ran down the sides, tasted the fluid that had pooled along the outer edge of the paper pile, and shot up yellow. "Oh God, no!" Annie shrieked. "Not Misery! Not Misery! Not her! No, no!" Now her face had begun to shimmer on the far side of the flames. "Wanna make a wish, Annie?" he shouted at her. "Wanna make a wish, you fucking goblin?" "Oh my God, oh Paul, what are you doing?" She stumbled forward, arms outstretched. Now the pile of paper was not just burning, it was blazing. The gray side of the royal had begun to turn black. Lighter fluid had pooled under it, and now pale blue tongues of flame shot up between the keys. Paul could feel his face baking, the skin tightening. "Not Misery," she wailed. "You can't burn Misery, you cockadoodle brat! You can't burn Misery!" And then she did exactly what he had almost known she would do. She seized the burning pile of paper and wheeled about, meaning to run to the bathroom with it, perhaps, and douse it in the tub. When she turned, Paul seized the royal, unmindful of the blisters its hot right side was printing on his already swollen right hand. He lifted it over his head. Little blue fire drops still fell from its undercarriage. He paid them no more mind than he did the flare of pain in his back as he strained something there. His face was an insane grimace of effort and concentration. He brought his arms forward and down, letting the typewriter fly out of his hands. It struck her squarely in the center of her white, solid back. "Oh!" It was not a scream, but a vast, startled grunt. Annie was driven forward onto the floor with a burning stack of paper under her. Small bluish flames like spirit lanterns dotted the surface of the board which had served as his desk. Gasping, each breath smooth hot iron in his throat, Paul knocked it aside. He pushed himself up and tottered erect on his right foot. Annie was writhing and moaning. A lick of flame shot up through the gap between her left arm and the side of her body. She screamed. Paul could smell frying skin, burning fat. She rolled over, struggling to her knees. Most of the paper was on the floor now, either still burning or hissing to ruin in puddles of champagne. But Annie still had some, and it was still burning. Her cardigan sweater was burning too. He saw green hooks of glass in her forearms. A larger shard poked out of her right cheek like the blade of a tomahawk. "I'm going to kill you, you lying cocksucker," she said, and staggered toward him. She knee-walked 3 steps toward him and then fell over on the typewriter. She writhed and managed to turn over halfway. Then Paul fell on her. He felt the sharp angles of the typewriter beneath her even through her body. She screamed like a cat, writhed like a cat, and tried to claw out from under him like a cat. The flames were going out around them, but he could still feel savage heat coming off the twisting, heaving mound beneath him, and he knew that at least some of her sweater and brassiere must be cooked onto her body. He felt no sympathy at all. She tried to buck him off. He held on, and now he was lying squarely on top of her, like a man who means to commit rape, his face almost on hers. His right hand groped, knowing exactly what it was looking for. "Get off me." He found a handful of hot charry paper. "Get off me." He crumpled the paper, squeezing flames out between his fingers. He could smell her. Cooked flesh, sweat, hate, madness. "Get off me," she screamed, her mouth yawning wide, and he was suddenly looking into the dank, red-lined pit of the goddess. "Get off me, you cockadoodle He stuffed paper, white, bond, and black charred onion skin into that gaping, screaming mouth. Saw the blazing eyes suddenly widen even more, now with surprise and horror and fresh pain. "Here's your book, Annie," he panted, and his hand closed on more paper. This bunch was hot, dripping wet, smelling sourly of spilt wine. She bucked and writhed under him. The salt dome of his left knee whammed the floor, and there was excruciating pain. but he stayed on top of her. I mean, I can't say this too many times. I'm gonna argue, alright, Annie? I'm gonna argue because all I can do is the worst I can do. So suck my book. Suck my book. Suck on it until you fucking choke. He crumpled the wet paper with a convulsive closing jerk of his fist and slammed it into her mouth, driving the half-charred first bunch farther down. Here it is, Annie. How do you like it? It's a genuine first. It's the Annie Wilkes edition. How do you like it? Eat it, Annie. Suck on it. Go on and eat it. Be a doobie and eat your book all up. He slammed in a third wad, a fourth. The fifth was still burning. He put it out with the already blistered heel of his right hand as he stuffed it in. Some weird muffled noise was coming out of her. She gave a tremendous jerk, and this time Paul was thrown off. She struggled and flailed to her knees, her hands clawed at her blackened throat, which had a hideously swelled look. Little was left of her sweater but the charred ring of the neck. The flesh of her belly and diaphragm bubbled with blisters. Champagne was dripping from the wad of paper which protruded from her mouth. "Urgh, urgh, urgh," Annie croaked. She got to her feet somehow, still clawing at her throat. Paul pushed himself backward, legs sticking untidily out in front of him, watching her warily. She took one step toward him, two. Then she tripped over the typewriter again. As she fell this time, her head twisted at an angle, and he saw her eyes looking at him with an expression that was questioning and somehow terrible. "What happened, Paul?" "I was bringing you champagne, wasn't I?" The left side of her head connected with the edge of the mantelpiece, and she went down like a loose sack of bricks, striking the floor in a vast tumble that shook the house. Annie had fallen on the bulk of the burning paper. Her body had put it out. It was a smoking black lump in the middle of the floor. The puddles of champagne had put out most of the individual pages, but 2 or 3 had wafted against the wall to the left of the door while still burning brightly, and the wallpaper was alight in spot, but burning with no real enthusiasm. Paul crawled over to his bed, pulling himself on his elbows, and got hold of the coverlet. Then he worked his way over to the wall, pushing the shards of broken bottle out of his way with the sides of his hands as he went. He had strained his back. He had burned his right hand badly. His head ached. His stomach roiled with the sick, sweet smell of burned meat. But he was free. The goddess was dead, and he was free. He got his right knee under him, reached up clumsily with the coverlet, which was damp with champagne and striped with smeary black swaths of ash, and began to beat at the flames. When he let the coverlet fall into a smoking heap at the baseboard, there was a big smoking bald spot in the middle of the wall, but the paper was out. The bottom page of the calendar had curled up, but that was all. He began to crawl back toward the wheelchair. He was halfway there when Annie opened her eyes. God, this is intense. Huh. Alright. Paul stared unbelieving as she got slowly to her knees. Paul himself was propped on his hands, legs trailing out behind him. He looked like a strange adult version of Popeye's nephew, Sweet Pea. No. No, you're dead. You are in error, Paul. You can't kill the goddess. The goddess is immortal. Now I must rinse. Her eyes were staring, horrible. A huge wound, pink-red, glared through her hair on the left side of her head. Blood sheeted down her face. "Dirt!" Annie cried through her throat full of paper. She began to crawl toward him, hands outstretched, flexing. "Ooh, dirt!" Paul pulled himself around in a half circle and began to crawl for the door. He could hear her behind him. And then as he entered the zone of broken glass, he felt her hand close around his left ankle and squeeze his stump excruciatingly. He screamed. "Dirt!" Annie cried triumphantly. He looked over his shoulder. Her face was turning slowly purple and seemed to be swelling. He realized she actually was turning into the Borka's idol. He yanked with all his might and his legs slithered footlessly out of her grasp, leaving her with nothing but the circlet of leather with which she had capped the stump. He crawled on, beginning to cry, sweat pouring down his cheeks. He pulled himself along on his elbows like a soldier advancing beneath heavy machine gun fire. He heard the thud of first one knee from behind him, then the other, then the first again. She was still coming. She was as solid as he had always feared. He had burned her, broken her back, stuffed her tubes full of paper, and still, she was coming. Bert! Annie screamed now. Dirt! Bert! One of his elbows came down on a hook of glass and it jabbed up into his arm. He crawled forward anyway, with it sticking out of him like a pushpin. Her hand closed over his left calf. Oh, go, oh, ah! He turned back again, and yes, her face had gone black. A dusky, rotted plum black from which her bleeding eyes bulged wildly. Her pulsing throat had swelled up like an inner tube, and her mouth was writhing. She was, he realized, trying to grin. The door was just in reach. Paul stretched out and laid hold on her of the jam in a death grip. Go, oh, ow! Her right hand on his right thigh. Thud, one knee. Thud, the other. Closer. Her shadow falling over him. No, he whimpered. He felt her tugging, pulling. He held onto the jam grimly, eyes now squeezed shut. Go, oh, ah! Over him. Thunder. Goddess thunder. Now her hands scuttled up his back like spiders and settled upon his neck. Go, oh, dirt, Bert. His air was gone. He held the jam and felt her over him, felt her hands sinking into his neck, and he screamed, Die! Can't you die? Can't you ever die? Can't you go? The pressure slackened. For a moment he could breathe again. Then Annie collapsed on top of him, a mountain of slack flesh, and he couldn't breathe at all. Ooh, shit, this is getting intense. Alright. I need to pour myself more hot tea, because mine keeps getting cold. Ooh. It's getting intense. Alright. Ooh. Let me just take a sip. And let me do a little stretch. Ooh. Yeah. There we go. Alright. Let's see. He worked his way out from under her like a man burrowing his way out of a snow slide. He did it with the last of his strength. He crawled through the door, expecting her hand to settle around his ankle again at any moment. But that did not happen. Annie lay silent and face down in blood and spilled champagne and fragments of green glass. Was she dead? She must be dead. Paul did not believe she was dead. He slammed the door shut. The bolt she had put on looked like something halfway up a high cliff, but he clawed his way up to it, shot it, and then collapsed in a shuddery huddle at the door's foot. He lay in stupor for some unknown length of time. What roused him from it was a low, minute scratching sound. The rats, he thought, Then Annie's thick, blood-grimed fingers poked under the door and tugged mindlessly at his shirt. He shrieked and jerked away from them, his left leg creaking with pain. He hammered at the fingers with his fist. Instead of pulling back, they jerked a little and lay still. Let that be the end of her. Please, God, let that be the end of her. In horrible pain now, Paul began to crawl slowly toward the bathroom. He got halfway there and looked back. Her fingers were still poking out from under the door. As bad as his pain was, he could not stand to look at that, or even think of that, and so he reversed direction, went back, and pushed them under. He had the nerve himself to do it. He was certain that the moment he touched them, they would clutch him. He finally reached the bathroom, every part of him throbbing. He pulled himself inside and shut the door. God, what if she's moved the dope? But she hadn't. The untidy litter of boxes was still there, including the ones containing the sample packets of Novril. He took 3 dry, then crawled back to the door and lay down against it, blocking it with the weight of his body. Paul slept. When he woke up, it was dark, and at first he didn't know where he was. How had his bedroom gotten so small? Then he remembered everything, and with his remembering a queer certainty came. She was not dead, even now not dead. She was standing right outside this door. She had the axe, and when he crawled out, she would amputate his head. It would go rolling off down the hallway like a bowling ball while she laughed. That is crazy, he told himself. And then he thought he did, a little rustling sound. The sound of a woman's starched skirt, perhaps, brushing lightly against the wall. You just made it up. Your imagination. It's so vivid. I didn't. I heard it. He hadn't. He knew that. His hand reached for the doorknob, then fell uncertainly back. Yes, he knew he had heard nothing. But what if he had? She could have gone out the window. Paul, she's dead. The return, implacable in its illogic. The goddess never dies. He realized he was frantically biting his lips and made himself stop it. Was this what going crazy was like? Yes. He was close to that, and who had a better right? But if he gave in to it, if the cops finally returned tomorrow or the day after, to find Annie dead in the guest room and a blubbering ball of protoplasm in the downstairs bathroom, a blubbering ball of protoplasm who had once been a writer named Paul Sheldon, wouldn't that be Annie's victory? You bet. And now, Polly, you're going to be a good little doobie and follow the scenario, right? Okay. His hand reached for the knob again, and faltered again. He couldn't follow the original scenario. In it, he had seen himself laying the paper and her picking it up, and that had happened. Only he was to have bashed her brains in with the fucking typewriter, instead of hitting her in the back with it. Then he had meant to work his way out into the parlor and light the house on fire. The scenario had called for him to effect his escape through one of the parlor windows. He would take a hell of a thump, but he had already seen how fastidious Annie was about locking her doors. Better thumped than crisped, and as he believed John the Baptist had once said. In a book, all would have gone according to plan, but life was so fucking untidy. What could you say for an existence where some of the most crucial conversations of your life took place when you needed to take a shit or something? An existence where there weren't even any chapters. Very untidy, Paul croaked. Good thing there's guys like me just to keep things rinsed, he cackled. The champagne bottle hadn't been in the scenario, but that was minor compared to what the woman's hideous vitality and his current painful But that was minor compared with the woman's hideous vitality and his current painful uncertainty. And until he knew whether or not she was dead, he couldn't burn the house down, making a beacon that would bring help on the run. Not because Annie might still be alive. He could roast her alive with no qualms at all. It wasn't Annie that was holding him back. It was the manuscript. The real manuscript. What he had burned had been nothing more than an illusion with the title page on top. Blank pages interspersed with written rejects and culls. The actual manuscript of Misery's return had been safely deposited under the bed, and there it still was. Unless she's still alive. If she's still alive, maybe she's in there reading it. So what are you going to do? Wait right in here, part of him advised. Right in here where it's nice and safe. But another, braver part of him urged him to go through with the scenario. As much of it as he could, anyway. Get to the parlor, break the window, get out of this awful house. work his way to the edge of the road, and flag down a car. Under previous circumstances, this might have meant waiting for days, but not anymore. Annie's house had become a drawing card. Summoning all of his courage, he reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door swung slowly open on darkness. And yes, there was Annie. There was a goddess standing there in the shadows, a white shape in a nurse's uniform. He blinked his eyes tightly shut and then opened them. Shadows, yes. Annie, no. Except in the newspaper photographs, he had never seen her in her nurse's uniform. Only shadows. Shadows and so vivid imagination. He crawled slowly into the hall and looked back down toward the guest room. It was shut, blank, and he began to crawl toward the parlor. It was a pit of shadows. Annie could be hidden in any of them. Annie could be any of them. And she could have the axe. He crawled. There was the overstuffed sofa, and Annie was behind it. There was the kitchen door, standing open, and Annie was behind that. The floorboards creaked in back of him. Of course, Annie was behind him. He turned, heart hammering, brains squeezing at his temples. And Annie was there, all right, the axe upraised, but only for a second. She blew apart into shadows. He crawled into the parlor, and that was when he heard the drone of an approaching motor. A faint wash of headlights illuminated the window, brightened. He heard the tires skid in the dirt and understood they had seen the chain she'd strung across the driveway. A car door opened and shut. Shit, look at this. He crawled faster, looked out, and saw a silhouette approaching the house. The shape of the silhouette's hat was unmistakable. It was a state cop. Paul groped on the knick-knack table, knocking figurines over. Some fell to the floor and shattered. His hand closed around one, and that at least was likely a book. It held the roundness novels delivered precisely. It held the roundness novels delivered precisely, because life so rarely did. It was the penguin sitting on his block of ice. Now my tale is told. The legend on the block read, and Paul thought, yes, thank God. Propped on his left arm, he made his right hand close around the penguin. Blisters broke open, dribbling pus. He drew his arm back and heaved the penguin through the parlor window, just as he had thrown an ashtray through the window of the guest bedroom not so long ago. Here, Paul Sheldon cried deliriously. Here and here, please. I'm in here. Alright. Let's take another sip. Okay. Wait, there's like a hair in my mouth. Ugh. I think I got it. There was yet another novelistic roundness in this denouement. They were the same two cops who had come the other day to question Annie about Kushner, David and Goliath. Only tonight David's sport coat was not only unbuttoned, his gun was out. David turned out to be Wicks. Goliath was McKnight. They had come with a search warrant. When they finally broke into the house in answer to the frenzied screams coming from the parlor, they found a man who looked like a nightmare sprung to life. There was a book I read when I was in high school, Wicks told his wife early the next morning. Count of Monte Cristo, I think. Or maybe it was The Prisoner of Zenda. Anyway, there was a guy in that book who'd spent 40 years in solitary confinement. He hadn't seen anybody in 40 years. That's what this guy looked like. Wicks paused for a moment, wanting to better express how it had been, the conflicting emotions he had felt. Horror and pity and sorrow and disgust. Most of all, wonder that the man who looked this bad should still be alive. He could not find the words. When he saw us, he started to cry, he said, and finally added, he kept calling me David. I don't know why. Maybe he looked like somebody he knew, she said. Maybe so. Paul's skin was gray. his body rack thin. He huddled by the occasional table, shivering all over, staring at them with rolling eyes. "Who?" McKnight began. "Goddess," the scrawny man on the floor interrupted. He licked his lips. "You have to watch out for her. Bedroom. That's where she kept me. Pet writer. Bedroom. She's there." "Annie Wilkes?" "Wicks. In that bedroom?" He nodded. Toward the hall. Yes. Locked in. But of course, there's a window." "Who?" McKnight began a second time. "Christ, can't you see?" Wicks asked. "It's the guy Kushner was looking for. The writer. I can't remember his name, but it's him." "Thank God," the scrawny man said. "What?" Wicks bent toward him, frowning. "Thank God you can't remember my name." "I'm not tracking you, buddy." "It's alright. Never mind. Just, you have to be careful. I think she's dead, but be careful. If she's still alive, dangerous, like a rattlesnake." With a tremendous effort, he moved his twisted left leg directly into the beam of McKnight's flashlight. "Cut off my foot. Axe." They stared at the place where his foot wasn't for long seconds, and McKnight whispered, "Good Christ." "Come on," Wicks said. He drew his gun, and the two of them started slowly down the hall to Paul's closed bedroom door. "Watch out for her," Paul shrieked in his cracked and broken voice. "Be careful." They unlocked the door and went in. Paul pulled himself against the wall and leaned his head back, eyes closed. He was cold. He couldn't stop shivering. They would scream or she would scream. There might be a scuffle. There might be shots. He tried to prepare his mind for either. Time passed, and it seemed to be a very long time indeed. At last he heard her booted feet come back down the hall. He opened his eyes. It was Wicks. "She was dead," Paul said. "I knew it. The real part of my mind did. But I can still hardly be..." Wicks said, "There's blood and broken glass and charred paper in there. But there's no one in that room at all." Paul Sheldon looked at Wicks, and then he began to scream. He was still screaming when he fainted. Holy shit. Just when you think it's over. Ugh. Well, we've got about 20 pages left at this point. I'm hoping I can get this all squared away soon, because my cat's starting to get she's starting to get mad. She's like sitting at the door like meowing, waiting for me or something. "You will be visited by a tall, dark stranger," the gypsy woman told Misery. And Misery, startled, realized two things at once. This was no gypsy, and the two of them were no longer alone in the tent. She could smell Gwendolyn Chastain's perfume in the moment before the madwoman's hands closed around her throat. In fact, the gypsy who was not a gypsy observed, "I think she is here now." Misery tried to scream, but could no longer even breathe. Misery's child. It always looked that way, Boss Ian, Hezekiah said. "No matter how you look at her, she seemed like she'd be looking at you. I don't know if it be true, but the Borkas, they say even when you get behind her, the goddess, she seemed to be looking at you." "But she is, after all, only a piece of stone," Ian remonstrated. "Yes, Boss Ian. That would give her her power." Misery's return. Number one. You're number one fan. These sounds, even in the haze. Oh shit! It's like it's starting like back to the very start. Fuck! This is. Oh shit! Now I must rinse, she said, and this is how it rinses out. None after Wicks and McKnight carried him from Annie's house on a makeshift litter. Paul Sheldon was dividing his time between Doctor's Hospital in Queens and a new apartment on the east side of Manhattan. His legs had been rebroken. His left was still in a cast from the knee down. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, the doctors told him that he would walk, and eventually he would walk without pain. His limp would have been deeper and more pronounced if he had been walking on his own foot instead of a custom-made prosthesis. In an ironic sort of way, Annie had done him a favor. He was drinking too much and not writing at all. His dreams were bad. When he got out of the elevator on the 9th floor one afternoon in May, he was for a change thinking not of Annie, but of the bulky package tucked clumsily under his arm. It contained 2 bound galleys of Misery's Return. His publishers had put the book on a very fast track, and considering the worldwide headlines generated by the bizarre circumstances under which the novel had been written, it was hardly surprising. Hastings House had ordered an unprecedented first printing of 1 million copies. And that's only the beginning, Charlie Merrill, his editor, had told him at lunch that day. The lunch from which Paul was now returning with his bound galleys. This book is going to outsell everything in the world, my friend. We all just ought to be down on our knees thanking God that the story in the book is almost as good as the story behind the book. Paul didn't know if that was true, and didn't really care anymore. He only wanted to get it behind him and find the next book. But as dry days became dry weeks, became dry months, he had begun to wonder if there ever would be a next book. Charlie was begging him for a non-fiction account of his ordeal. That book, he said, would outsell even Misery's Return. Would in fact outsell La Coca. When Paul asked him, out of idle curiosity, what he thought the paperback's rights for such a book might fetch, Charlie brushed his long hair away from his forehead, lit a Camel, and said, "I believe we could set a floor at $10 million and then conduct one hell of an auction." I keep getting hiccups. He did not bat an eye when he said it. After a moment or two, Paul realized he either was serious or thought he was. But there was no way he could write such a book, not yet. Probably not ever. His job was writing novels. He could write the account Charlie wanted, but to do so would be tantamount to admitting to himself that he would never write another novel. And the joke is, it would be a novel, he almost said to Charlie Merrill, and then held back at the last moment. The joke was, Charlie wouldn't care. It would start out as fact, and then I'd begin to tart it up. Just a little at first, then a little more, then a little more. Not to make myself look better, although I probably would. And not to make Annie look worse, she couldn't. Simply to create that roundness. I didn't want to fictionalize myself. Writing may be masturbatory, but God forbid it should be an act of auto-cannibalism. His apartment was 9E, farthest from the elevator, and today the corridor looked 2 miles long. He began to stump his way grimly down to it, a T-shaped walking stick in each hand. Clack, 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 clack. God, he hated that sound. His legs ached sickeningly and he yearned for Novril. Sometimes he thought it would be worth being back with Annie just to have the dope. The doctors had weaned him from it. The booze was his substitute, and when he got inside, he was going to have a double bourbon. Then he would look at the blank screen of his word processor for a while. What fun! Paul Sheldon's $15,000 paperweight. Clack, 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 clack. Now to get the key out of his pocket without dropping either the manila envelope containing the bound galleys or the sticks. He propped the sticks against the wall. While he was doing that, the galleys dropped out from under his arm and fell to the rug. The envelope split open. "Shit," he growled, and then the sticks fell over with a clatter, adding to the fun. Paul closed his eyes, swaying unsteadily on his twisted, aching legs, waiting to see if he was going to get mad or cry. He hoped he would get mad. He didn't want to cry out here in the hall, but he might. He had. His legs hurt all the time and he wanted his dope, not the heavy-duty aspirin they gave him at the hospital dispensary. He wanted the good dope, his Annie dope. And oh, he was so tired all the time. What he needed to prop him up were not those shitty sticks, but his make-believe games and stories. They were the good dope, the never-fail fix, but they had all fled. It seemed playtime was finally over. This is what it's like after the end, he thought, opening the door and tottering into the apartment. This is why no one ever writes it. It's too fucking dreary. She should have died after I stuffed her head full of blank paper and busted pages. And I should have died then too. At that moment, if at no other, we really were like characters in one of Annie's chapter plays. No grays, only blacks and whites, good and bad. I was Joffrey and she was the Borka bee goddess. This, well, I've heard of denouement, but this is ridiculous. Never mind the mess back there on the floor. Drinky poo first, picky uppy poo second. First be a don't be, and then be a... He stopped. He had time to realize the apartment was too dark, and there was a smell. He knew that smell, a deadly mixture of dirt and face powder. Annie rose up from behind the sofa like a white ghost dressed in a nurse's uniform and cap. The axe was in her hand, and she was screaming, "Time to rinse, Paul! Time to rinse!" He shrieked, tried to turn on his bad legs. She leaped to the sofa with clumsy strength, looking like an albino frog. Her starched uniform rustled briskly. The first sweep of the axe did no more than knock the wind from him. This was really what he thought until he landed on the carpet smelling his own blood. He looked down and saw he was cut nearly in half. "Rinse!" she shrieked, and there went his right hand. "Rinse!" she shrieked again, and his left was gone. He crawled toward the open door on the jutting stumps of his wrists, and incredibly the galleys were still there. The bound galleys Charlie had given him at lunch in Mr. Lee's. Sliding the manila envelope to him across gleaming white napery, while music drifted down from overhead speakers. "Annie, you can read it now," he tried to scream, but only got "Annie, you," before his head flew off and rolled to the wall. His last dimming glimpse of the world was his own collapsing body, and Annie's white shoes standing astride it. Goddess, he thought, and died. Scenario, an outline or synopsis. A plot outline. Webster's New Collegiate. Writer, one who writes, especially as an occupation. Webster's New Collegiate. Make-believe, pretense or pretend. Webster's New Collegiate. Polly, can you? Yes, of course he could. The writer's scenario was that Annie was still alive, although he understood this was only make-believe. He really did go to lunch with Charlie Merrill. All the conversation was the same. Only when he let himself into his apartment, he knew it was the cleaning woman who had pulled the drapes. And although he fell down and had to smother a scream of fright when Annie rose up like Cain from behind the sofa, it was just the cat, a cross-eyed Siamese named Dumpster he had gotten last month at the pound. That's lovely. Isn't there a cross-eyed cat, like right now, who's named like Breakfast or whatever? I remember seeing something like that. There was no Annie because Annie had not been a goddess at all. Only a crazy lady who had hurt Paul for reasons of her own. Annie had managed to pull most of the paper out of her mouth and throat, and it had gotten out through Paul's window while Paul was sleeping, the sleep of drugs. She had gotten to the barn and had collapsed there. She was dead when Wicks and McKnight found her, but not of strangulation. She had actually died of the fractured skull she had received when she struck the mantle, and she had struck the mantle because she had tripped. So in a way, she had been killed by the very typewriter Paul had hated so much. But she'd had plans for him, all right. Not even the axe would suffice this time. He had found her outside of Misery the pig's stall, with one hand wrapped around the handle of her chainsaw. That was all in the past, though. Annie Wilkes was in her grave, but like Misery Chastain, she rested there uneasily. In his dreams and waking fantasies, he dug her up again and again. You couldn't kill the goddess. Temporarily dope her with bourbon, maybe, but that was all. He went to the bar, looked at the bottle, then looked back at where his galleys and walking sticks lay. He gave the bottle a goodbye look and worked his way back to his stuff. Rinse. Let me take a sip. Half an hour later, he was sitting in front of the blank screen, thinking he had to be a glutton for punishment. He had taken the aspirin instead of the drink, but that didn't change what was going to happen now. He was going to sit here for 15 minutes or maybe half an hour, looking at nothing but a cursor flashing in darkness. Then he was going to turn off the machine and have that drink. Except he had seen something funny on the way home from lunch with Charlie, and it had given him an idea. Not a big one, just a small one. After all, it had only been a small incident. Just a kid pushing a shopping cart up 48th Street, that was all. But there had been a cage in the cart, and in it had been a rather large furry animal which Paul at first thought was a cat. A closer look had shown him a wide white stripe up the cat's back. "Sonny," he said, "is that a skunk?" "Yeah," the kid said, and pushed the shopping cart along a little faster. He didn't stop for long conversations with people in the city, especially weird-looking guys with bags the size of Samsonite two-suiters under their eyes, who were lurching along on metal walking sticks. The kid turned the corner and was gone. Paul went on, wanting to take a cab, but he was supposed to walk at least a mile every day. And this was his mile, and it hurt like hell, and to take his mind off the mile, he started wondering where that kid had come from, where the shopping cart had come from, and most of all, where the skunk had come from. He heard a noise behind him, and turned from the blank screen to see Annie coming out of the kitchen, dressed in jeans and a red flannel logger's shirt, the chainsaw in her hands. He closed his eyes, opened them, saw the same old nothing, and was suddenly angry. He turned back to the word processor and wrote fast, almost bludgeoning the keys. 1. The kid heard a sound in the back of the building, and although the thought of rats crossed his mind, he turned the corner anyway. It was too early to go home because school didn't let out for another hour and a half, and he had gone truant at lunch. What he saw crouched back against the wall in a dusty shaft of sunlight was not a rat, but a great big black cat with the bushiest tail he had ever seen. He stopped, heart suddenly pounding. "Polly, can you?" This was a question which he did not dare answer. He bent over the keyboard again, and after a moment began to hit the keys, but more gently now. It wasn't a cat. Eddie Desmond had lived in New York City all his life, but he had been to the Bronx Zoo, and Christ, there were picture books, weren't there? He knew what that thing was, although he hadn't the slightest idea how such a thing could have gotten into this deserted East 105th Street tenement. But the long white stripe down his back was a dead giveaway. It was a skunk. Eddie started slowly toward it, feet gritting in the plaster dust. He could. So, in gratitude and in terror, he did. The hole opened and Paul stared through at what was there, unaware that his fingers were picking up speed, unaware that his aching legs were in the same city but 50 blocks away, unaware that he was weeping as he wrote. Lovell, Maine, September 23rd, 1984. Bangor, Maine, October 7th, 1986. Now my tale is told. That's it. The end. We did it. We did it. We sure did, alright. Yeah! Woo! Yeah, I like that. I mean, I feel like everyone who reads this book is always gonna be like a little bit disappointed when Annie doesn't like die in the like grandiose fashion that we all wanted her to, but I guess that was kind of intentional in a way. Yeah, I like this book. As strange as it was in a lot of ways, it was a very engaging story. Let me take a sip. Yeah, I was actually thinking about like what kind of story I should like read after this one. And because I like reading books out loud like this, and I mean, I know it's not like the most engaging sort of stream content, but I really enjoy it. And I like practicing my narration and all that good stuff. So I was thinking for my next ASMR read, I was thinking of doing The Last Unicorn by what was the guy's name? Let me pull it up real quick. By Peter S. Beagle. I actually already downloaded the PDF of it, because I'm pretty sure I wouldn't even be able to find this book in like a library anyways. But yeah, it might be like a couple weeks before I get into that, just to like give the segments like a bit of breathing time. But I think I'm gonna like keep it going with that one as my next one. And I was also thinking, because I got my paycheck today, and I got my bonus that I was promised for that whole kerfuffle in September from my day job. And I've been starting to look into like a better quality mic, because honestly the Blue Snowball I've been having like a lot of like ire with lately, and I just feel like it's becoming time for like a change, like a bit of an upgrade, you know. But yeah, wait, hold on, I need to go through and look at this. So there were a lot of subs like a few days ago. I forgot to, well, I didn't forget to, but I just like, they kind of got lost in the shuffle. And I just wanted to like read them out. So we got Blythe Make, Can Bread, Quico, and Kuma Venus. They all followed me a few days ago. And I always want to like shout people out when they do that, so there's that. But yeah, I guess that's just gonna be like the end of it, you know? It was a good book. I really enjoyed it. Now, I guess with that, I really don't have like much else to say here. I am gonna be streaming again tomorrow. We're gonna be finishing Ib. I almost said Yumaniki for whatever reason. But yeah, we're gonna be finishing up Ib. I'm only gonna get like one ending because I don't want to work for I don't want to like work for like all the other ones, but we will like, I'll like pull up some kind of like YouTube video of the other endings, and we can just like watch that like on stream. Because I don't want to like leave people hanging or anything. But yeah, we're gonna it was certainly a Stephen King book. He's very odd. Yeah. Very peculiar, yep. Yeah, I guess yeah, that's really all I have to say for now. I hope people enjoyed it as much as I did. I know there's at least like a couple of you who are like listening intently, so That makes me happy. But yeah, I guess I'm just gonna go ahead and sign off here. So everybody have a good morning, evening, afternoon, night, whatever it is, wherever you are. And I love you.